Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm the Dean of the Institute, as well as an historian of the U.S. in the 20th century. I'm delighted that you could join us today for the public symposium that is part of this wonderful three-day Freedom Rising conference. Last evening, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Eric Foner opened the conference at the Museum of African American History. Tomorrow evening, the Tremont Temple will host a performance of Roots of Liberty, the Haitian Revolution, and the American Civil War. But today, it's our turn. I'm pleased for a number of reasons that the Radcliffe Institute is providing the site for this symposium. The Institute's mission is to bring together leading thinkers from all disciplines and the arts to engage in transformative work. Today's program is a perfect example of just the kind of convening function we like to serve. The speakers you will hear from bring a wide range of perspectives to this important exploration of the Emancipation Proclamation and emancipation in an hemispheric context. And personally, I have to admit that I love the idea of having so many historians here at Radcliffe. The Radcliffe Institute is also dedicated to being a common space at Harvard. We provide neutral ground where faculty, students, and other members of the university community can come together to begin conversations that seed new research and forge new connections. Freedom Rising is appropriately the work of many Harvard units, led by the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research and the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, in collaboration with the Boston African American National Historic Site. In addition, Harvard's Charles Warren Center, Houghton Library, History Department, African and African American Studies Department, Committee on African Studies, and Office of the President have contributed to the program. We are grateful to all of these partners and many more for their collaboration in mounting today's event. Most importantly, the Radcliffe Institute is proud to be part of Freedom Rising because of the momentous occasion we are marking with this symposium. This is, of course, an anniversary that needs to be commemorated in our society. It is a reminder that political documents, legal changes, and constitutional amendments matter. But it is also a reminder that social, cultural, and behavioral changes are needed for these political interventions to have real impact on American lives. Today's symposium addresses both dimensions. The 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation has been celebrated in many different ways across the country and here at Harvard. But Freedom Rising is remarkable because it asks us to think about emancipation in a much broader context, considering gender issues, the service of African Americans in the military, artistic expression, historic roots in Haiti and elsewhere, and global repercussions. The conversations I expect will take place here today are not ones you are likely to hear elsewhere, and certainly not alongside each other. I expect a rich and unique exploration of this enormously important subject, and I am honored that the Radcliffe Institute is serving as your host. I want to turn the podium now over to Donald Yacovone. Donald is the Manager of Research and Program Development at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute here at Harvard, and he was instrumental in getting Freedom Rising off the ground. Please join me in welcoming Donald to the podium and thanking him for all his work to make today's symposium possible. I'd also like to thank Radcliffe's Events and Academic Ventures departments for collaborating with Donald. Donald, it's your turn.
Thank you and good morning. This is just wonderful, and after almost 3 years of organizing this, it's just fabulous to see it. We had a fabulous evening last night with Professor Foner. Anyway, we have been blessed, truly blessed, with a fabulous set of collaborators who have made the Freedom Rising program possible. First, I want to thank Dean Liz Cohen, Rebecca Weissman, and their staff here at the Radcliffe Institute for all their very hard work, support, and pinpoint professionalism. I can't stress that enough. We are so lucky to be here in this beautiful facility and so very fortunate that Dean Cohen volunteered to host this public symposium. I also want to especially thank the Office of the President of Harvard University. Without Drew Faust's support, this symposium would not have been possible. Additionally, I want to acknowledge the Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research for their very considerable assistance and support. Its director, Henry Louis Gates, Jr., allowed me to include this series of events in my schedule. And to thank, and I want to thank the executive director, Abby Wolf, and my colleagues, especially Matt Weinberg and Justin Sneed, for all their very hard work in support of this event. I can't say enough wonderful things about David Harris, Managing Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at the Harvard Law School. His judgment is sound and his patience almost endless. Excuse me. For those of you who attended his event featuring Ken Burns' new PBS special, The Central Park 5, you know just how good a professional he is. I have worked closely with him for several years now and have collaborated with him, and collaboration with him has been one of the major benefits of working here at Harvard. Also, I want to thank his colleague at the law school, Ethan Thomas, who heroically, and I mean heroically, worked through a painful illness and late contributors to produce the beautiful program you have in your hands and the terrific poster for Roots of Liberty. At a time of economic recession and vexing politics, your National Park Service has stepped up with a huge investment in our program. With the invaluable assistance of Superintendent of Boston National Historical Park and Boston African American Historic Site, Cassius Cash, and the NPS Northeast Region, and even the National Office in Washington, he and they have made this series of events one of the Park Service's highest priorities, investing tens of thousands of dollars without which there would be no Roots of Liberty performance tomorrow. Additionally, NPS staff Terry Brown, Ryan McNabb, and Marty Blatt embody the highest ideals of our National Park Service. And we in the greater Boston area are so very lucky to have them as public servants. In particular, I have worked with Marty since the glory days of 1996 and 97. He is a national leader in public history, and to borrow from the best album ever made, I am honored to have one last waltz with him in this organizing sesquicentennial. There is a full list of our partners in your program, but I want to single out Beverly Morgan Welch, director, and her staff at the Museum of African American History. The museum fills a vital role in preserving and presenting the history of Boston's African American community, and please go see their exhibition on Freedom Rising, which is on display until the end of this year. Additionally, the Houghton Library is also featuring, Houghton Library here on campus, is also featuring an exhibit on the Civil War, Boston's Crusade Against Slavery, in conjunction with our events, which will run until August 23rd. And this evening, there is an event at the Harvard Bookstore on Mass Avenue for a special issue of Transition magazine, which is operated out of the Du Bois Institute, New Narratives of Haiti, that will start at 7:30 this evening. I also want to acknowledge the support of the African American Experience Fund, the History Channel, the Lowell Institute, Mass Humanities, which is a branch of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and and Harvard's History Department. Finally, working with Catherine Carr Kelly, Executive Director of Central Square Theater, and Deborah Wise and Megan Sandberg-Zakian of the Underground Railway Theater at Central Square has been simply marvelous, and the performance they have assembled, Roots of Liberty, is a work of genius. You really don't want to miss this. If you have not done so, please sign up at the website, and in fact, it's www.freedomrising2013.com, which I think you all know, and you'll later on you'll be able to see recordings of this event, last night's event, and the Tremont Temple event. They'll all be there permanently for your viewing. The Tremont Temple event, as I think you know, features Danny Glover, and then there will be a post-performance discussion with Glover, Edwidge Dentacott, who contributed to the script, and in conversation with Henry Louis Gates, Jr. We have been organizing Freedom Rising not so much to celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation, but to interrogate its impact and place it in wide and varied contexts. We want to bring highly trained specialists in conversation with the public to the benefit of both and to better fulfill our role as educators. And there is no more important issue for us to focus on than the decline of slavery and the definition of freedom that followed. From our contemporary vantage point, the Emancipation Proclamation may appear inevitable and an act of simple justice. But from the perspective of 1863, especially from the view of free Northern blacks who had been struggling for freedom since the founding of the nation, nothing could be further from the truth. We must see history from their perspective of people who did not know the future and were painfully aware of their own pasts. Remember that the United States Supreme Court in 1857 had declared that African Americans had no rights that white men were bound to respect. This was an era in which a congressman could, and did, stand up in the U.S. Capitol and declare without embarrassment or opposition that, quote, "This is a government of white men, made by white men, for white men, to be administered, protected, defended, and maintained by white men." That about covers it, I think. In 1860, as the black abolitionist John Locke lamented, if the present aspect of things is an index of the future, then, indeed, our prospects are gloomy. Of the two great political parties in this country, one is openly hostile to us and seeks to reduce us to the position of beasts of burden, and the other has evidently but little sympathy for us, only as we may serve to advance its interests. That same year, the Republican Party promised to fully implement the fugitive slave law and guarantee forever slavery in the states where it existed, even by constitutional amendment, if necessary. Of Lincoln, as many black abolitionists said, his inauguration instilled in them a, quote, "more dead despair of our future here than at any other time in our lives." Well, events turned out differently, for sure. In 1861, his was just, or appeared to be just another pro-slavery administration, as the New York Weekly Anglo-African declared, embodying the, quote, "godless will of a criminal nation." Lincoln sincerely hated slavery, but loved the Union more and continued to espouse his lifelong commitment to colonization. As we learned last night, if we didn't know it already, in August 1862, he met with a delegation of Washington, D.C. black leaders to convince them to spread the idea of colonization to their brethren. In widely reprinted remarks, Lincoln explained the evil impact of slavery on white men, asserting that blacks and whites could never live together in freedom, and he held that African Americans were responsible for starting the war, and finally declared that it was in everyone's best interest that blacks leave the country. Thus, when the final Emancipation Proclamation was to take effect on January 1st, 1863, no one was sure the president was going to keep his word. When he did, the response was, in fact, as dramatic as you have imagined, with celebrations here in Boston and in every major city in the North. Though in the midst of praise, one can find learned reserve. African Americans thanked God, not the president, for this change. And as one celebrant remarked, Abraham was merely, quote, God's bell ringer. And the change certainly was momentous, changing a war for the Union to one to end slavery, just as Frederick Douglass had predicted would happen at the war's start. But equally important was the oft-overlooked provision missing from the preliminary proclamation of September 1862, allowing for the general recruitment of black troops. For African Americans, this change possessed enormous consequences for the future. giving them the basis for their appeal to full citizenship and the equal rights they had been asking for since the era of the American Revolution. It would be, to their minds, how freedom would rise. Okay, now, on with the show. The way this will work, I will introduce the chair of the panels, and he or she will then introduce the individual panelists, and they will talk for 10 minutes. At 12 minutes, smoke will start to appear, and at 15, a trapdoor, which the Institute has cleverly put here, will send them straight to Dartmouth College. So, so we will keep to the time limit for all. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of History and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies here at Harvard University. She is a great teacher and student mentor and a fabulous colleague. Her published work spans an impressive range of subjects, including African American religious history, women's history, and civil rights. She has thoroughly rewritten the classic African American survey, From Slavery to Freedom, which was published by John Hope Franklin back in 1947, and which she published to great acclaim in 2010. Professor Higginbotham also co-edited with Henry Louis Gates Jr. the African American National Biography, reissued this year in 12 volumes, containing about 5,000, just under 5,000 biographical entries. She is the editor-in-chief of the comprehensive Harvard Guide to African American History, and is perhaps best known for her prize-winning work, Righteous Discontent, the Women's Movement in the Black Baptist Church, 1880 to 1920. She has received many awards, including the Living Legacy Award from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, a member of the American Philosophical Society, and she has received the Carter G. Woodson Scholars Medallion from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. In 2008, the Urban League awarded her the Legend Award. She is a living legend here on the Harvard University campus. I turn it over to you.
Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce this first panel, Black Communities, Women, and Civil Rights. And we have a wonderful group. I'm going to move quickly because of our time constraint. Our first speaker is Lois Brown. She is the class of 1958 Distinguished Professor at Wesleyan University, where she teaches in the African American Studies program and in the English department. Her teaching and scholarship focus on African American and New England history, the history and culture of the 18th and 19th centuries, African American memory, as well as the politics of identity, faith, and privilege in colonial antebellum America. Her published works include Pauline Elizabeth Hopkins, Black Daughter of the Revolution, which was published in 2008, and she published the first modern edition of the 1835 work entitled Memoir of James Jackson, the Attentive and Obedient Scholar, aged 6 years and 11 months, by Susan Paul. This was the first African American biography and the first prose narrative by an African American woman, and this book was published in 2000 by Harvard University Press. The title of Lois Brown's paper today is Civil War, Uncivil Scenes, African American Women and the Work of Emancipation.
Good morning. Thank you, Evelyn. There may be something heartening in the fact that the first conversation of today's symposium focuses on women and centers that discussion about them, literally, as the panel's title shows, between the topics of community and civil rights. As we navigate the historic promise of emancipation and the complicated anniversary of Lincoln's proclamation, it is clarifying, too, to know that this year also marks another milestone anniversary. It has been 100 years since the passing of Harriet Tubman. Born Araminta Ross, she was the general whose battlefield was the world and whose regiments were comprised of children, women, and men determined to claim a truer life and some kind of liberty for themselves in the years before, during, and even after the Civil War. War, that rhetorically, visually coded masculine prerogative, and its most awful scenes often become so, not just because of the lives lost and the damage done, but because of the symbolic and sentimental, life-sustaining realm of any distance from that symbolic and sentimental realm of any comforting 19th century domestic sphere. One might expect that the very presence of women on the battlefield creates a sense of wartime domestic order, complete with innovative wartime recipes and repurposed kitchen equipment. Yet it is, as it should be, much more complex and much more storied than that. When women like the intrepid Harriet Tubman, Susie King Taylor, a composed Civil War nurse and soldier's wife, who was the first woman to publish, African-American woman to publish memoirs of a Civil War life and the battlefields, and Charlotte Forten, an adventurer and gifted teacher imbued with romantic sensibilities. When these three traveled to the Civil War front lines and began the work of emancipation, they beheld unruly, undomestic, uncivil scenes. Their encounters transformed them, and now what we might posit as community and civil rights, R-I-T-E-S, processes undertaken to reach and go well beyond the perimeter of the nation's ideals. Lincoln's proclamation, which deployed freedom broadly yet selectively, insistently yet for some much too meekly, was launched as the war raged on. The work of emancipation began even as guns were firing and bayonets were landing. Tubman, King, and Forten journeyed into this volatile world. What they beheld, initiated, and assessed provides a stirring measure of what it means to see freedom rising. In one of those glorious synchronicities that historians love, these three women converged on the same place at about the same time. Port Royal, South Carolina, a place teeming with evidence of slavery's value and the brutality of enslavement. Taylor was just 14 years old in 1862 when her family escaped to the Union-held St. Simon's, and within hours of reaching there, she was smashing all sorts of notions about what African Americans could and could not do, and was commissioned as a school teacher for the formerly enslaved of the region. In the fall of 1862, Charlotte Forten arrived, breathless, grateful to be miles away from that hateful city of Philadelphia, and undaunted by the fact that she was the first and only Northern teacher of color in the Corps. Tubman was there at the request of Governor Andrew of Massachusetts to facilitate what her biographer Catherine Clinton has referred to as lifelines for thousands of enslaved people who were caught between war, Union camps, and far-off freedom. But those lifelines were as much for the enslaved as they were for those enlisted. Tubman's reconnaissance missions made her indispensable to the Union Army, so much so that she achieved the unprecedented when she became the first African-American woman to lead a Civil War mission. News of what came to be known as the Combahee River Raid traveled fast, and Bostonians learned of it in the papers. Quote, Colonel Montgomery and his gallant band of 300 black soldiers under the guidance of a black woman dashed into the enemy's country, declared the Boston Commonwealth newspaper. They struck an extraordinary blow, an effective blow, destroying millions of dollars worth of commissary stores, cotton and lordly dwellings, and striking terror into the heart of rebeldom. They brought off near 800 slaves and thousands of dollars worth of property without losing a man or receiving a scratch. It was a glorious consummation. The colonel, after making some remarks, was followed by a speech from the black woman who led the raid and under whose inspiration it was originated and conducted. For sound sense and real native eloquence, her address would do honor to any man, and it created a great sensation. So clearly for us, that phrase brought off near 800 slaves and thousands of dollars worth of property without losing a man or receiving a scratch bears all the marks of Tubman's expertise. Yet she, the architect, the leader of this raid, was hardly heralded. Her courage, the sizable devastation of Confederate resources, some 8,000 to 10,000 bushels of grain on one plantation alone, was overwhelmed by this image of a needy black community, some 750 enslaved people taken from 9 plantations held by men whose names were listed as owners in the Charleston Mercury, for instance. When the Mercury lamented what it called, quote, the mortifying circumstance of the success of a marauding expedition of this character, were its editors and its readers cringing because this circumstance had been effected by a woman? Was Tubman, this female figure, even to be seen in either regional or military accounts during or after the raid? The papers of the day say not exactly. As we trace freedom rising and the emancipation being proclaimed, we still need to ask how the unimagining, the unnaming of this woman, of women altogether, shapes, enables, and disables the emancipatory imagination, the American romance, and the idealized, exhaustive Civil War historiography. Yet this notion of unnaming cuts both ways. Susie King Taylor, who came to Boston after the war and published her memoir here in 1902, presents the almost always unpresented history of black women who witnessed the nation staggering towards institutionalized freedom, citizenship, and suffrage. In addition to bearing witness to the many women and men who traveled with the men of their families in the regiments of color, she also talked about all sorts of things about Civil War camp life and the unceasing threat to civilians in the regiment. Then there are accounts, such as this haunting recollection, one that followed by barely 3 months, the second historic battle at Fort Wagner, which saw the bravery of Colonel Robert Gould Shaw and the men of the 54th. Quote, Fort Wagner, being only a mile from our camp, I went there 2 or 3 times a week and would go up on the ramparts to watch the gunners send their shells into Charleston, which they did every 15 minutes, and had a full view of the city from that point. Outside of the fort were many skulls lying about. I have often moved them off to the side, out of the path. The comrades and I would have quite a debate as to which side those men fought on. Some thought they were the skulls of our boys. Others thought they were the enemy's. But as there was no definite way to know, it was never decided which could lay claim to them. They were a gruesome sight, those fleshless heads, those grinning jaws. But by this time, I had become accustomed to worse things, and I did not feel as I might have earlier in my camp life. This new normal, if you will, compels us to articulate the domestication of trauma and the feminization of the battlefield that is littered with unclaimed, unknowable remains. So, perhaps this is as good a time as any to leap into the romantic imaginings of Charlotte Forten, a woman who could not approach that same battlefield at Fort Wagner like Susie King Taylor, and who likely would cease to breathe were she to behold those ungodly remnants that Susie King Taylor encountered often. Forten, a Philadelphia-born, Salem-educated, well-to-do young woman, wanted desperately to go to the Civil War South, and as that proclamation was launched, she declared, "So I must go." And she declared this after some machinations by well-meaning Quakers and intervention from John Greenleaf Whittier. She got there. There were many conversations about how she did not belong in that community in South Carolina because she was a different person, a freeborn northerner, educated, activist daughter of privilege. But more than that, though, it seems that she went south encased in an almost impenetrable armor, one engineered by her voracious reading. She lamented, for instance, when she had to race for the boat that would take her south, that due to the conflicting times about departure times, that she wasn't able to get a copy of Les Miserables to take. And she was very disappointed because her brother had given her money precisely for that purchase. So this armor was engineered by her voracious reading and her demonstrated capacity for soaring metaphor, expansive allusion, and gorgeous prose. Time today certainly does not permit as full a critique of Forten's experience of emancipation, of community and activism as we so easily could generate. So let me conclude by focusing on what Forten was determined to see, even as tragedy barreled its way through her world. En route to Port Royal, Fortin survived what she called, quote, a veritable storm at sea, in which she was able to proudly claim that she had many naps, even as the boat was coming apart. And she notes proudly and with palpable composure, quote, the day is most lovely. I am feeling well and luxuriating in the glorious beauty of sea and sky. You would never know there was war on the horizon. One would think that that glorious beauty in which she reveled would be annihilated by the realities of war. But her American romance ensured an ability to see beauty and to insist on new civil rights behaviors. The mission for Civil War rights inspired her. It informed her interactions in the South. And this is most clear in those winsome notes that she made about Colonel Robert Gould Shaw in the days before the assault on Fort Wagner. Summer of '63, Monday, July 6. I am more than ever charmed with noble little Colonel Shaw. What purity, what nobleness of soul, what exquisite gentleness in that beautiful face. As I look at it, I think the bravest are the tenderest. I can imagine what he must be to his mother. May his life be spared to her. Yesterday at the celebration, he stood leaning against our carriage and speaking of mother so lovingly, so tenderly. He said he wished she could be there. If the regiment were going to be stationed there for some time, he should send for her. But you know, he said, we might suddenly be ordered away, and then she would have nobody to take care of her. I do think he is a lovable person. Tonight he helped me on my horse, and after carefully arranging the folds of my riding skirts, he said so kindly, goodbye. If I don't see you again down here, I hope to see you at the house. But I hope I shall have the pleasure of seeing him many times, even down here. He and his men are eager to be called into active service. The siren's call into active service threatens the idyllic, displaced domestic bliss, even fantasy, that Fortin imagines, having with Shaw and with the noble, valiant regiment. Yet as the journal confirms, the wartime prerogative of women, to bring mother to the front, to recreate a sense of civil community, and to imagine and plan for elegant civil encounters, realigns the priorities of emancipation and insists on the pervasive, non-negotiable power of civility in all its forms. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Susie King Taylor was not alone in her great reservations about the nation's ability to even create a readable present, much less a reliable historical account of itself. Today, we are still in limbo, at a vexed crossroads, one for which there is no male-authored roadmap to peace. All the more reason, then, as we mark national milestones and as we invite each other to define and redefine community and to delineate the work that supposedly should happen within, it's right then that we insistently acknowledge and disassemble the essentialized we the people and take careful and precise account for each and every home and for each of those who was brave. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Annalisa Cox. She is a historian of race relations in the 19th century Midwest. She is the author of A Stronger Kinship, published by Little Brown, and it was the winner of the Michigan Notable Book Award. Annalisa Cox is a consultant to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. She is an honorary member at Western Michigan University and an associate at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute. Her presentation today is Lincoln's Neighbors.
Thank you for being here today. In this talk, I will briefly describe the various African Americans, free and otherwise, whom I have been surprised to find living and working around the young Lincoln during his time on the Indiana frontier. I have been studying the movement of free African American pioneers to the antebellum Midwestern frontier for a number of years, so I already knew that there were roughly 63,000 African Americans living in the old Northwest states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin by 1860. I also knew that most of these African Americans lived in rural farming communities, and that free African Americans had created around 70 settlements in these states, and I feel like I'm finding more every day, some of them dating back to the 1810s. But it wasn't until a couple of years ago, while on a trip to southwestern Indiana with a curator from the Smithsonian's new Museum of African American History and Culture, that I discovered this startling connection between Lincoln and African American pioneers. I was introducing the curator to the community of Lyle Station, an African American farming community whose roots go back 200 years. And on our drive there, we passed billboard after billboard advertising Lincoln's boyhood home. Now, I am no political historian, but even I know a bit about the 16th president. And I realized with a shock that all of these African American pioneers arriving in southern Indiana in the first 2 decades of the 19th century were surrounding the young Lincoln. I should add here that there's no smoking gun. No long hidden note in Lincoln's hand about this friend or that friend who happened to be African American in Indiana. Rather, there is evidence of the many African Americans living and working around Lincoln, where there were thought to be few or none. And the implications of their presence around Lincoln are intriguing. Indeed, the Lincoln family would have had to work hard to avoid running into African Americans, enslaved or free, in southern Indiana. While Abraham's father, Thomas, seems to have tried to avoid such contacts on a daily basis, the young Abraham did not. Let me explain. The Lincoln family moved from Kentucky to Indiana in 1816. But even before that, African Americans and the fraught issues of slavery and race had become a part of the Lincoln family's life. It all started around 1811, when Paul and Susanna Mitchum, a seemingly harmless elderly white couple from North Carolina, moved to the Lincoln's home county of Hardin, Kentucky, about 20 miles from where the Lincoln family was living. Now, 20 miles may seem a long way, but the road between the Mitchum farmstead and the nearest town of Elizabethtown went right past the Lincoln's home. And when the Mitchums arrived, some very interesting people started walking that road. African Americans were not unheard of in that region of Kentucky. After all, this was a slave state. And as Eric Foner has pointed out in his excellent book, slaves in chains may have walked past the road to Elizabethtown, along the road of Elizabethtown past the Lincoln's birthplace. But the African Americans coming with the Mitchums were not slaves in chains. Indeed, they were moving freely on their own, working hard in nearby mines, farming and making quite a success of their lives. And there were a lot of them. The Mitchums initially brought about 40 people, but more came from North Carolina and Virginia every day, traveling that road through Elizabethtown and past the Lincoln's place. These African Americans came because the Mitchums were abolitionists, and they had a long-term plan to free all the people they held in bondage, as well as the many people their friends had held as slaves across the river in Indiana. But they couldn't easily do that in North Carolina. Already, slave states in our young nation were putting up fierce legal blocks to freedom. Indiana, however, was still a territory and had few such restrictions. That does not mean, however, that all whites in southern Indiana warmly welcomed free African American settlers. Far from it. In the midst of all these goings-on, Abraham's father, Thomas, decided that it was time to move. His brother, Abraham's uncle Josiah, lived just outside of Corydon, Indiana, a town of about 200 that was looking forward to statehood and was positioning itself to become the new state capital. But when Thomas visited his brother around 1814, all hell had broken loose in Corydon because the first of the Mitchum folks had arrived. I can't imagine what it must have been like for Abraham's father when he arrived in Corydon, only to find the same African Americans who'd been settling in his county, Kentucky, now moving there. I can imagine, however, what most of the landowning white men in Corydon thought about it, for they wrote a viciously racist petition to the territorial governor about these new settlers, requesting that they be removed immediately. One of the milder sentences reads, Believe me, my dear sir, my paradise will be converted into a hell if those Negroes remain in this neighborhood. There is no record of the governor's response, but in the end, the African Americans stayed. Indeed, one became Corydon's first physician. Abraham's uncle, Josiah, also decided to stay put, despite his new black neighbors. But by 1816, Abraham's father decided not to settle near his brother. Instead, he bought some poor scrubland in Spencer County, a less settled area full 60 miles west of Corydon. At that time, records show only 5 people of African descent in the county Thomas had chosen for his family's new home. And the 1830 census records only 13 free African Americans living in Spencer County. Those particular African Americans in Spencer, however, were a very interesting bunch. One of them, a William Rickey, was married to a white woman. Another, a woman who only went by the first name of Sarah, was heading her own farmstead. However, Abraham Lincoln didn't stay in Spencer County. Indeed, he seemed eager to be quit of the place. And if any of you have visited his boyhood home, I can't say I blame him. It is really in the middle of nowhere. Lincoln had long traveled around the various bordering counties, many of which held free and landed African Americans. But in 1826, at the age of 17, he made his move, heading 18 miles south to the little town of Troy on the Ohio River, where he made his home on and off for the next 2 years. There, the young Abraham was faced with all aspects of African American life in early America. As Nikki Taylor has pointed out in her book on African Americans in Cincinnati, free African American riverboat owners and steamship workers were common on the Ohio River. Indeed, the river was the main source of employment for Cincinnati's African Americans, widely known as freezies. On the steamships, these freezies would have worked on many levels, from boiler room engineers to the beautifully dressed stewards on deck. Lincoln, as a ferry operator, taking passengers to board these ships, would have been in almost constant contact with these free African Americans. Yet the African Americans that Lincoln would have seen during his years in Troy were not just freezies. For this was a time and place where people were bought and sold like livestock, and Lincoln was working a river that carried much of this misery. Long before his trip down the Mississippi, the young Lincoln would have been brought face to face with one of the most appalling aspects of slavery, the shipment of people in bondage to be sold at market. Years later, he would write his friend Joshua Speed in an oft-quoted letter describing such a scene, noting, and I quote, "There were on board 10 or a dozen slaves shackled together with irons. That sight was a continual torment to me, and I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio." While this description comes from Lincoln's later years in Illinois when he was a passenger on board, he makes clear to stress that such a sight was not new to him, but a common occurrence throughout his life. There was another aspect of slavery on the river that Lincoln would have been aware of. While it was used to transport people in bondage, it was also a vehicle for freedom. Lincoln could not have avoided knowledge of all those who was trying to use its waters to escape from enslavement. This brings us to one of the most interesting aspects of the young Lincoln's time at Troy. Since Lincoln was so close-mouthed and dry-penned about his youth in Indiana, it can be challenging to draw clear conclusions from what I've learned about the African Americans around Lincoln, but there's one thing we can know for certain. He chose not to hunt people. Now, we all know he hunted vampires. That's a given. But surely the great emancipator would never have been a slave catcher. But he did have the option. They were really, really common along the river. And how tempting that option would have been. After all, here is a young man in his late teens, desperately trying to better himself and clearly uncomfortable with the slurs hurled his way as the son of a poor literate farmer from the scrublands. And here is the Ohio River, that great River Jordan, which both free blacks and those escaping bondage had to cross in order to get to freedom. And every one of those people of African descent standing on the Kentucky shore, trying to figure out how they would safely cross, were walking wealth, whether slave or free. Their bodies were commodities and of no little value. Abraham could easily have been tempted to take his vessel into the river at night to see if there was anyone on the other shore. Or he could have just paddled to the middle of the river to listen for the sound of labored breathing and the splashing of someone who preferred the risk of drowning to living a life in bondage. He certainly would have seen or known of the floating bodies of those who've been willing to risk everything for freedom. Given all of the temptations and reasons, one could easily understand how a tall, strong teenage boy who hankered for independence and a chance to get ahead in the world might choose, even if just once, to accost and capture a person for gain. But he did not. Slavery was a business, and businesses keep records, and there are no records of Abraham Lincoln capturing and returning a human being back into bondage. So what, if anything, do all of these experiences in his first 21 years of life have to do with Lincoln's decision to end slavery 150 years ago? I have my thoughts, but I will leave those for the question and answer session. What I do know, however, is that during his time in Indiana, Abraham Lincoln was faced with all the diverse and complex aspects of African American life in early America, and those experiences profoundly shaped his attitudes and beliefs as an adult and as our 16th president. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Kate Masur, is Associate Professor of History and African American Studies at Northwestern University, and she's the author of An Example for All the Land, Emancipation and the Struggle Over Equality in Washington, D.C. She has published prize-winning scholarly articles about emancipation during the Civil War, and most recently, a piece about African American federal employees in Washington during and after the war. The title of her talk today, Freedom and Citizenship in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. Good morning. I am going to go out on a limb and start by asking, who here saw the movie Lincoln? Okay. Good. So if you saw the movie, you know that there were a couple of characters who sort of were on the margins of the movie a little bit. Elizabeth Keckley was one of them, and a man named William Slade was another. You probably remember Keckley pretty well. She was a companion of Mary Lincoln in the movie. She attended sessions of the House of Representatives. She has a conversation with Lincoln in front of the White House where they discuss a little bit emancipation. William Slade is an even smaller character in the movie. He is a butler. He has only a couple of speaking lines, and at the end, as Lincoln is going off to Ford's Theater, he tries to hand Lincoln the gloves. So those are the two characters that actually were real people in history, and I want to focus a little bit on them today and describe their world, a world that you did not see in the movie, and their role in helping to claim and define citizenship and civil rights at the precise moment that slavery was crumbling. So the subtitle of my talk, the title of my talk is Freedom and Citizenship in Washington, D.C. The subtitle is, or What Steven Spielberg's Lincoln Didn't Tell You About Lincoln's Black Employees. So it's probably useful to say at the outset that for all the transcendence implied in the word freedom, destroying slavery was one thing, but building a multiracial democracy was quite another. And Eric Foner's talk last night touched on this issue. Lincoln, for example, was adamantly against slavery, but wasn't at all sure what he thought, or in fact, for most of his life, was against the idea that the United States, or didn't believe that the United States could ever become a biracial democracy. So I don't want to diminish how difficult it was, in fact, to end slavery. In the United States, it could not be done peacefully or consensually. Slavery had to be vanquished by force of arms. But ending slavery was really only the beginning, for then ensued a great debate about the rights and status of former slaves. Northerners knew this well. In the decades before the Civil War, slavery had gradually ended in the North, and black Northerners, with some white allies, had struggled mightily for equal rights and full citizenship. With the Civil War, the same unresolved questions confronted the South and the nation as a whole for the first time. Now, Washington, D.C. was a southern city, a slaveholding city nestled between two slaveholding states, Maryland and Virginia. Slavery was legal in Washington until Congress abolished it in the spring of 1862, 9 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. Before that, the city was in many respects similar to other urban places in the Upper South. The majority of African Americans in the capital on the eve of the Civil War were free, not enslaved, but their lives were circumscribed by discriminatory black codes, hostile policing practices, and racial discrimination in the labor market. Excluded from most professions and saddled with higher licensing fees in the trades, African Americans' job opportunities were restricted mainly to unskilled labor and service. A small number, however, were able to parlay special skills, education, or connections into leadership roles. In the decades before the Civil War, black Washingtonians built churches, organized schools, purchased property, and went into business, all while living in the shadow of slavery and under the strictures of the black codes. Indeed, in the years before the Civil War, black Washingtonians were well aware that nominal freedom did not lead inevitably to full citizenship and civil rights. This also meant that when the war came, black leaders in Washington were poised to insist on African Americans' worthiness of equal citizenship, to demand respect and equal treatment. And two key figures in that wartime movement were William Slade and Lizabeth Keckley, both featured in Spielberg's film, both who worked for the Lincolns and whom the Lincolns knew very well. William Slade and his wife, Josephine Slade, were originally from the D.C. area but had moved to Cleveland in the decade before the Civil War. In the summer of 1861, as the war was underway, they returned to the capital city and immersed themselves in public affairs. They joined the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, one of the city's most prestigious independent black churches, prestigious and activist churches. And William became president of an organization called the Social, Civil, and Statistical Association. Now, this was a black organization of black men that was kind of a mutual aid society, and it was a society that was organized for the uplift of Washington's African Americans. Now, this association was especially active in the first half of 1862 as Congress debated the D.C. Emancipation Act. Its members gathered statistics about black Washington, how many churches, how much property were owned, how many schools, whether African Americans were on the public dole or whether they were self-supporting. And they fed this information to radical Republicans in Congress who used it on the floor of Congress against those who insisted that emancipation would create a large class of people who would be a drain on public resources. So they mobilized facts about Washington's black community in the service of an argument for emancipation and equal citizenship. That same summer of 1862, there was much talk about the colonization of black Americans, something we heard a little bit about last night and which Donald Yacovone mentioned this morning. That is the idea that once freed, black people should leave the country rather than seek citizenship and equality here. It was that summer that President Lincoln called a delegation of black Washingtonians into the White House to propose that they emigrate to Central America. And that same summer, Slade's organization, the Social, Civil, and Statistical Association, took a vehement stand against colonization. The association met, passed resolutions against it, and ran several agents of colonization schemes out of town. In both instances then, in the collection of statistics, in running these colonization advocates out of town, this organization and Slade were laying the groundwork for claims to black citizenship. First, by arguing for African Americans' success and self-sufficiency, and second, by publicly asserting that leaving the country was out of the question. They would stay here and fight for equality here. Now, at the same time, William and Josephine Slade and Lizabeth Keckley and many, many other black Washingtonians were mobilizing to meet the needs of the thousands of runaway slaves who were coming into Washington. In black churches across the city, men and women convened to figure out what they could do with the resources they had. They formed Freedmen's Relief organizations and took up collections for clothing and food, and they urged their fellow city residents to offer shelter to the migrants if they could. The best known and best connected of these organizations was the one Lizabeth Keckley headed, the Contraband Relief Society. The base for Keckley's organization were the women of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, including Josephine Slade, William Slade's wife, who made a name for herself doing the difficult work of making home visits to the freed people or the fugitive slaves and distributing clothing and goods to them. And people commented later that she had actually a very frail constitution. She was not a very physically strong woman, and it was all the more admirable that she went out to these homes where people were living in real destitution, often with contagious diseases going around, and visited them and distributed these goods that they had collected. Now, Keckley's name was the most prominent because she was a widely respected, skilled dressmaker with close ties to the Lincolns. In fact, that fall, Mary Todd Lincoln made a large donation to the society and allowed Keckley to publicize the fact of that donation on a tour she made north to fundraise. And she actually came to Boston to the Church of Leonard Grimes, the 12th Baptist Church here in Boston, or over there in Boston, and spoke in the church and raised money and clothes for the freed people in Washington. So Freedmen's Relief work involved men and women, pastors and lay people, and of course it also involved William Slade. Late in the fall of 1862, Washington's black Freedmen's Relief activists decided to create an umbrella organization to coordinate the work of the city's many societies. Meeting in November, they chose as the president of this new citywide organization, William Slade, who had already done so much to help mobilize the city's black population for citizenship and civil rights. So what you can begin to see here is an infrastructure of black organizations dedicated to meeting the challenges of emancipation and pushing the agenda forward toward inclusion and equality in civic life. In 1863, their attention shifted to the recruitment of black soldiers, and these same activists stayed in the mix. William Slade, for example, was among those who supported black men's enlistment, but insisted that the government must pay black soldiers equally and press the Confederacy to treat them not as insurrectionary slaves, but according to internationally recognized laws of war. Black Washingtonians would gladly enlist, Slade told a government commission, if, quote, the president pledged himself to protect them if taken prisoner in the rights of prisoners of war. At the same time, Slade and 67 other black men, calling themselves colored citizens of Washington, D.C., wrote Lincoln and Edwin Stanton, expressing confidence that a black regiment could be raised in the capital and stating their preference for whom the officers should be. That summer, the women of the Contraband Relief Association turned their attention to black soldiers and their families. They raised money to purchase a regimental flag for the first U.S. colored troops. They commissioned a black artist in Philadelphia to design the flag. And they dedicated themselves to providing food, clothing, and shelter first now to wives and children of men who were away at the war. Once again, leading black men and women of Washington were mobilizing for citizenship on two fronts by demanding that the government treat black people as equals to whites, on the one hand, and by doing everything they could to help people who were in need on the other. Their relief work was not only expressed compassion and provided real aid, it also reinforced to a doubting white public that African Americans were competent to be citizens, that they had resources, wherewithal, and the crucial quality of independence that was so valued in 19th century culture. Now, by drawing attention to the work of Keckley and the Slades, I don't mean to suggest that elite, well-connected black Washingtonians like them were the only ones who were defining and demanding citizenship. The men of the first U.S. colored troops, for example, once in uniform, took to the city's Jim Crow streetcars and demanded the right to ride as equals to whites. Increasingly during the war, black people of all walks of life paid visits to the Capitol building, watching the proceedings of Congress in an assertion of the citizenship to which they aspired. By 1864, William Slade was adding his name to petitions for voting rights for black men, and later in the 1860s, Josephine Slade was part of a biracial women's voting rights organization in Washington, D.C. On so many levels then, at the moment that freedom came to the capital city, amid a consuming, murderous war, black women and men were pushing further, insisting that freedom had little meaning if not accompanied by a sense of belonging, of public respect, and of equal treatment in policy and law. Their actions were public. They were visible. Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln knew what those activists were doing, and we should too. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final speaker is Stephen Kantrowitz. Stephen Kantrowitz is professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author of More Than Freedom, Fighting for Black Citizenship in a White Republic, 1829 to 1889. and this was published in 2012. And he's also the author of Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy, which was published in 2000. Today, Professor Kantrowitz will be speaking on the topic, Black Bostonians and the Limits of Freedom.
Good morning. The presentations this morning notwithstanding, Black Northerners are rarely at the center of our conversation about 19th century American life, about the Civil War, about slavery and emancipation. Our narrative tends to run from south to north and from slavery to freedom. And that's where the numbers were. And that is, in some ways, the big story in broad strokes as well as the very fine-grained one. But though the population of Black Northerners in the 19th century was comparatively small, 250,000 people at the most, they played a crucial role in forcing a crisis in American political life, that is, the crisis over slavery. But not only that, they posed an ongoing challenge to the white republic, to a racialized democracy, by embodying and asserting the possibility of a multiracial republic, and by pulling white anti-slavery people in that direction. That is to say, Black Northerners were central to the coming of the Civil War in ways that we have not fully reckoned with, and they were central to making freedom mean what it did when it finally came for everyone. In my remarks, I'm going to focus particularly today on the Black activists of Massachusetts, which may seem completely fitting given the circumstances here, but in other respects is quite an odd choice, apparently, because it's such a small population, numbering in the thousands, not even remotely close to the populations of New York or Philadelphia, let alone the free Black population of Baltimore. Nonetheless, because of the particular circumstances in which this tiny population of free Black people lived, because of their particular circumstances as both the freest and most formally equal Black population in the United States, that is, the population least hemmed in by restrictive laws, most able to exercise, not completely, but fuller rights of citizenship than almost any other Black population. They were even more conscious, perhaps, than other free Black Northerners of the ways that slavery and white supremacy continued to shadow and hem them in. They grew up among the monuments and the memories of the revolutionary generation. Indeed, they were free in part by virtue of the state's revolutionary constitution, which begins with the words, "All men are born free and equal." That unambiguous statement of what's left ambiguous in the federal charters. They lived among fellow Christians and fellow Americans, and yet, as Professor Mazur just pointed out, they were blocked from trades and professions, they were segregated in churches, they never knew when they would pass unnoticed in a crowd or on a street, when they would be Jim Crowed or not, when they would be mobbed or not. And, perhaps most vexingly, most of the white people who declared themselves their friends were colonizationists. It's in this context, in the late 1820s, that a Massachusetts resident, a free Black man named David Walker, publishes the Appeal to the Colored Citizens. In this work, he urges African Americans to lift themselves up and create solidarity with one another through education and hard work, but he's primarily concerned with excoriating the savagery of slavery, the hypocrisy of white Christianity, and the selfishness of colonization. In a critical passage, he reaches past that excoriation, the Jeremiah that this pamphlet constitutes, and extends a hand to his white neighbors, to the great majority of the population of Massachusetts, of the North, and says to the whites, "Throw away your fears and prejudices then, and enlighten us and treat us like men, and we will like you more than we do now hate you. And tell us no more about colonization, for America is as much our country as it is yours. Treat us like men, and there is no danger, but we will all live in peace and happiness together. For we are not like you. hard-hearted, unmerciful, and unforgiving. And here's the key line: what a happy country this will be if the whites will listen. This foreshadows the next 30 years in which Massachusetts African Americans recruit whites, William Lloyd Garrison perhaps most famously, but a succession of women and men, not only to fight slavery alongside them, but to embrace them as equals and allies and comrades. And Massachusetts therefore witnesses the rise of an interracial abolitionist movement, never fully successful at overcoming white supremacy within its own ranks, but arguably the first place where there were people, mostly blacks, but some whites, constantly insisting that one must try to overcome that white supremacy, constantly pushing at the remaining formal barriers of segregation in Massachusetts, pushing at, interestingly, the state militia, which by the federal militia law of the 18th century was restricted to able-bodied white men. Well, understanding that martial manhood is a critical element of 19th century citizenship, free black activists in Massachusetts pressed for inclusion in the state militia. Robert Morris, the first black man to try a case in Massachusetts, is at the lead of this movement, pressing not only for the creation of a unit that will march in the streets and represent black manhood as citizenship, but critically, to do that having been fully recognized and authorized by the state legislature. Not only for have the state legislature invite them to join, but also to remove the word white from the state's militia law. And until the state agrees to do that, they won't march. They have uniforms, they have weapons, they have drilled, they're ready, but they won't march until the state does it, until they're doing it under the full color of the law. And as a result, they never do. Not in the 1850s, anyway. They press for the removal of the word colored from the tax and jury rolls and for their inclusion on the juries as a result of that, though that too does not succeed in the 1850s. And they press for the desegregation of public education, which in Boston remained segregated in the first half of the 1850s through boycotts and blockades that involve men and women and children, trying to make sure that the segregated Smith School remains shuttered, through pressing the school committee, through pressing the legislature. This movement, this coalition of black and white radicals pressing against slavery and against segregation ultimately takes the political forms not only of petition and protest by men and by women, but of partisan political form. It bears political as well as spiritual and activist fruit. Because Massachusetts is one of the few places in the nation where African American men can vote, it's also the site of the first local interracial political coalitions in Boston and New Bedford. And in close elections, the hundreds of voters constituted by these communities can and do alter the balance of party politics. Most notably, it's the Boston alliance between white know-nothings and Republicans in the legislature and 400 or so black voters on Beacon Hill. That alliance in 1855, trading black support for the know-nothing legislature for desegregation of the public schools, that desegregates the Boston public schools in 1855. This is a deal cut between abolitionists who'd made their way into the know-nothing ranks and Lewis Hayden, John Rock, and Mark de Morty, who say, okay, this is a good deal, and we can get the thing we most want from it, which is the end of the segregation of the public schools. These anti-slavery politics also create some of the region's most radical personal liberty laws, which become models for those in other states. So there's a spiritual dimension and a political dimension, and there is also a militant dimension to this coalition. Black and white activists are so well organized as abolitionists and defenders as abolitionists, but also as defenders of fugitives. And Boston becomes the site of the most militant efforts in defense of them. Both successes, like William and Ellen Craft or Shadrach Minkins in 1851, and equally importantly, the failures, like Anthony Burns in 1854. And it's notable, I think, that even more than in the realm of formal political life. In fact, formal political life may be the only of these realms where women do not play a critical role. They play a critical role in the associational life and in the petition and protest life. They play also a critical role in the militant and martial life of protest against the fugitive slave law. It's only in partisan political life that they do not. We often conceive of these as separate tracks, as a kind of associational solidarity life, of a political and protest life, of an insurrectionary militant life, as distinct, but for many black activists in Massachusetts and elsewhere, they were inseparable. Last night, Eric Foner noted that there were no Republicans at Harper's Ferry, contrary to the suggestion of Southern fire eaters and their Northern allies that Republicans and abolitionists are one and the same, that Lincoln's party was the Black Republican Party. There may not have been Republicans at Harper's Ferry, but there was at least one of John Brown's recruiters, Boston's Lewis Hayden, was also a Republican ward heeler on Beacon Hill. And among the colored citizens of Massachusetts, as they describe themselves, Republican politicking and planning for insurrection could and did go hand in hand. Lewis Hayden and his comrades, black and white, male and female, were people who could say, and did, I have in my hand here a petition arguing for the desegregation of the public schools. We are going to present it to the legislature, and then we are going to go to the courthouse and beat in the door and rescue the fugitive slave. Come on. They're capable of all of these things at once. Together, and this is where I'll finish, the fruits of Massachusetts black activist community and its allies. Just think about this. A bold interracial social movement proclaiming the universal truth of racial equality and the legitimacy of violent action to defend fugitives. State laws that limit the power of slaveholders to return slaves. Political coalitions that rest in part on black voters. Put these together, and what do you have? The slaveholder's nightmare. Or more precisely, exactly the recipe that South Carolina's secessionists claim is the reason they must secede from the Union in 1861. If you read the December 1860 document, the Declaration of Immediate Causes, in which the South Carolina Secession Convention explains why they're leaving the Union, that is the list. And that list is created by the activity and the intense commitments of Boston's black activists. Thank you.
Yeah, questions. All right, we have plenty of time for questions. We're bringing up a mic. If you would just line up right at the mic and start in. This is a terrific start to this, to this conference. Absolutely fabulous. And I should also remind you that if you go to our website, Freedom Rising 2013, there are biographical sketches or CVs of our scholars here and the ones that will follow if you want more information. So, go ahead.
Where scholars fear to tread, I'm removed from the American historical expertise as anybody who's come here to give a talk. But I would like something really hit me in terms of is it working? In terms of Eric Foner's mention last night of the fact that Lincoln said we have to grant the vote to people who have served in the military. And then Stephen Kantorowicz said, treat us like men. So we have a post-emancipation, post-13th Amendment problem, that is the extension of the right to vote. So is there, and it's addressed to all of the people, is there a connection between the discussion over the extension of the right to vote and its limitations in which women played a particular role, especially black women who had been in service and could in fact appeal to that second inauguration?
Yeah, okay, all right. I'll take the first crack at that. This is it's an enormous problem, and it's understood from the moment that freedom is achieved, the moment that the war is ended. It's understood to be a central dilemma, and I think you can see in these talks the different ways that plays out. On the one hand, it's fair to say that the free black communities that have organized before and during the war are, in terms of gender equality, perhaps the most egalitarian communities you know, not perfect, please, but some of the most egalitarian communities. And the African American men here are some of the, I think, the very best women's rights men in 19th century America. That said, they are equally invested in the 19th century citizenship project, which closely ties military service to the franchise and to political citizenship, which is an old story, but still a very powerful one. And these dynamics cannot help but collide during and after the Civil War in a very profound way. They collide before it too, but it's after, when freedom has been achieved and when the vote is up in the air, that it's a real issue. This, in fact, splits the women's rights movement in half in the late 1860s. It's got a host of other consequences. I'll let the other panelists speak to this now.
One of the other things, it's not on, not working. Is it working now? It is. One of the other things I think that we see happening here is, and I was struck as all of the panelists were speaking, by the caveats, right? By the exceptions and the ways in which contracts are rewritten and redeployed. And we see that in the march towards the vote. Even if we think about that military service component and that representation and that recognition of manhood or presence, Harriet Tubman cannot get a pension. She was at the forefront of raids. She did not just appear on the beaches of South Carolina and, as history had it, for quite a long time, served Robert Gould Shaw his last breakfast. She actually sat at table with those officers and was served breakfast. And she could not get a pension. So before we can even imagine the vote, we have to go back and hold the government accountable for actually recognizing and compensating individuals for service. And so I think it's in the example of Harriet Tubman that we begin to get a sense of the true practicality around suffrage, and also the galling limitations of a nation that won't yet truly recognize service that was exemplary, visible, and successful. So I offer that alongside.
I just want to add to that too. I mean, one of our best memories of women's suffrage comes before the war with Sojourner Truth and her famous Aren't I a Woman? And that's in 1851, I think. She's speaking in Akron, Ohio. But I also wanted to say that black soldiers after the war, immediately after the Civil War, blacks met in meetings in their conventions or various groups. And they would make these statements that if we have carried muskets during the war, that we ought to be able to have the ballot after the war. And I think that demand was not something that, I think you should keep it in mind. It wasn't just a goodness of Washington that gave the vote, but that blacks are demanding it.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, just really quick, I think that there are so many different ways that African Americans make the argument for the vote. So they do mobilize the argument that we carried arms, we risked our lives for this country, but they also argue that no taxation without representation. We pay our taxes. They argue that this is that citizenship, many people thought citizenship and the vote were separable. They argue that part of citizenship was having the vote. So there are less gendered ways that African Americans also make the argument for the vote during the war, most famously at the Syracuse Convention in 1864 and after the war. And as you know, so people have mentioned that this creates this sort of schism in the women's movement. And one of the things that was really interesting that I found about Washington D.C. was that even as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony are increasingly turning toward a kind of racist idiom against black men's enfranchisement, there were a lot of white women and black women and men who didn't think that was the right direction for the movement, for the women's voting rights movement. And there was a cohort of those folks in D.C. who, including Josephine Slade and a woman named Josephine Butler, two black women. There was a white woman named, actually another Josephine Griffin. Anyway, a woman named Julia Wilbur who kept an incredible diary, who actually argued that Congress should enfranchise. Congress had power in D.C. to determine who could vote. So first, Congress enfranchised black men, and then these women said, well, and now you should make women vote. Use Washington as an example of women's suffrage. And they argued ward by ward. They went to the ward commissioners in each ward, and they went to Congress. They'd failed, but it was a kind of remarkable thing to begin to glimpse that going on kind of on the ground in the capital city.
And just very briefly, as Eric Fona very astutely pointed out, before the war, nobody knew the war was coming. So how do you argue about citizenship rights before military service? And the absolute platform for the African Americans I'm studying who are moving out onto the western frontier of the time to own property is about property ownership and the link between property ownership and citizenship. And on that front, an African American woman has a double whammy against her, right? Because of her extraordinary, women had such low legal rights even as property owners, and then throw that in the Midwest for being African American, where again, you're having your legal rights highly low, very, very much lowered. The argument for citizenship was based really and truly that they were going, for these African Americans, on the notion that we are property owners, we are land owners, we are colonizers of the frontier, thus we should be citizens.
Yeah, and I should add that when I was with the Black Abolitionist Papers, now a lifetime ago, I paid attention to the number of comments made by black leaders, black male leaders, and I found only about 20 individuals who had issued any kind of statement, mild to extreme, mostly on the mild side, in support of women's rights. I just think that at this time period, as you all know, women's rights simply wasn't going to get you anywhere in terms of American politics. Pardon? Well, Douglas was certainly the strongest, and everybody points to Douglas. But the hundreds of people who were represented in the Black Abolitionist Papers, only about 20 issued statements in support of women's rights. It just wasn't popular because I think, given the cultural demands, wasn't acceptable. So anyway, Peter, you want a question?
Good morning. This is more a compliment, I think, than a question, but I'm really struck by such terrific papers and the way that they open up connections between the white and black communities, the men and women, in ways that we haven't thought about enough before. I mean, I was at this school 50 years ago when they didn't even teach a Civil War history course. And it's amazing to see now that we've got a generation where we're really beginning to explore these connections, and especially with the women who are crucial to it. But I'm also struck that we're still just at the beginning, and we've really just got a few names that we can invoke and that we can say Sojourner Truth and Charlotte Fortin, and we know a little bit more about them, and people read a few documents. We're just barely getting going. And so I guess what I would say, I spent half my life living in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and that's where Elizabeth Keckley was from. And we worked on that in the local community for 30 years to even get a sign put up that she existed. And so I see her appearance on the silver screen as a glass more than half full. I mean, or let's say it's 1/6. You know, we've now added another major African-American woman, very as complicated as all the others we've invoked. We've now got access to her. And I see that movie as a window. I mean, Tony Kushner says he's thinking about making a whole movie about her. You know, I don't think he is ignorant of the work that you've done and others have done on Washington and on her background. But to me, it's just exciting that we're adding more people to this list. And I guess I'm struck that the more we add to this list, the more it multiplies, the connections between these people. So I've now found connections between Keckley in Hillsborough and the family of one of the blacks who was with John Brown at Harper's Ferry. I've found connections between white women who were in the Sea Islands and Charlotte Fortin, and we're only just beginning to knit these together. So I compliment you all on pushing us forward.
Eric, you want to comment?
One thing that I would say is that in so many ways, yes, we are at the beginning, and your very sobering note about 30 years worth of work to get a sign in this day and age, but also that the history, the material is there. It's hidden in plain view. It's hidden in plain view. So I think that it's critical that we go back to the history that we think we know. Yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, Tony Kushner, welcome to make a film about Elizabeth Keckley. It should not be the only one. It shouldn't. And I think it's that rewriting and reworking of the soil and the archives and expecting connection, expecting presence that enables us then to fill out this history in ways
I should
that are
add
powerful.
about hidden in plain view, though, that yes, we have our federal census records, which are a great source for me for finding a lot of these communities. But where I'm looking in places like southwestern Indiana, some of these stories are deliberately hidden. I mean, I literally found one of the Negro registers in a broom closet in the basement of a county courthouse. And they didn't actually, it took about 3 visits before they even wanted to tell me it was there. And it was the only record I had of a description of these free African-American landowners in that county. Otherwise, they're not there. Mm-hmm. So there's still challenges to finding these stories.
But you're looking for them.
Yeah,
but you're looking for them, and I think that's the difference.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I also want to thank you all for your wonderful presentations. I'm actually a Russian historian, and I was very curious about, because in Russia the narrative is that socialists and feminists don't get along, and I'm kind of curious about learning more, I don't know if this is so connected, about the multiracial alliances that you found in women's rights, because the dominant narrative here is that of the racism of the white women's rights movement. So I was very excited, really, and curious to find out what other evidence you found about multiracial women's rights alliances. And I just had another question, which is, you've talked a lot about Protestants and Know Nothing, and I'm wondering if there was any evidence of Catholics being involved in abolitionism, because it almost parallels what happened in the busing crisis when you talk about the integration of the schools in the 1850s. So anyway, those.
I think it's possible to overestimate the amount of interracial solidarity in the women's rights movement, and I think it would be unfortunate if people sort of came away from this thinking that there was this sort of, well, there are a lot of different things to be said about it. I mean, the argument, though, is that, or the point is that, as Steve was sort of talking about, I think the radical abolitionist movement was a space in the North where very political white and black women and men came together and rethought norms and rethought ideas. And part of why they were able to do that and why they did that was because they were interacting with one another. And it was a very special space, especially for white folks who were forced to learn what it was like in a context in which most white people didn't have all that much to do with black people in an asymmetrical way from the experience of African Americans in the North, which was always to have to interact with white people, at least in kind of work environments. And so out of that emerges the possibility of this kind of interracial solidarity in the post-Civil War period. But it is so tentative, it is so delicate, and there are so many ways in which the interests, the racism, the tendency to racism, or even to just kind of misunderstanding of the white women and different agendas of black women for whom the vote was not always the first priority, considering the different kind of challenges that African Americans, women and men together faced. And so the moments when people are able to come together for a particular campaign, for a particular effort to register to vote or to sort of demand the vote are remarkable, and we should talk about them, but we should also recognize the things that made that incredibly difficult.
I also want to, I'm intrigued by the possible connections, and I'd love to talk with you later, because my next book project's on Nancy Prince, who spends 10 years of her life in Russia, in St. Petersburg, in the 1820s. But to come back to your question, in the ways in which we see African American women making their way into the institutionalized world of abolition and anti-slavery, the networks, I think, and the advocacy and the engineering that's required are quite substantial. And William Lloyd Garrison is a delight in that regard, because he's mischievous, and he is, and he names what he sees. So when in the 1830s, the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society, comprised of well-to-do white women in Boston who are earnest and focused in their effort to abolish slavery and work towards that and do the political work that is essential to all the political gain that will come later, they invite him to give a talk, and he says, thank you very much, ladies, but I would like you to use the time that you have given me, that you would give me, to sit and talk among yourselves about why it is that when you're working for slavery, there's not actually any person of color in the room. And the Boston Post was back and forth. The horses were sweating and foaming at the mouth. And within the course of 3 days, they were able to report, we are not racist, we take your, oh, no, we have thrown open the doors, their language, we have thrown open the doors of our society to an African-American woman who happened to be Susan Paul. It didn't just happen to be Susan Paul, though, because William Lloyd Garrison founds the New England Anti-Slavery Society in the African Meeting House, in the African Baptist Church. That is Susan Paul's father's church. When he's moving abolitionists around to educate them, he takes them to Susan Paul's schoolroom, where they hear young children of color not just singing quaint little songs about sheep and hills, but talking about the evils of colonization and the work of slavery. So the visible work of women and the ways in which African American women are both modeling and anticipating, and even men as well, like the Mass General Colored Association, the Massachusetts General Colored Association predates the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and those men come into that movement, but the one we remember and talk about the most, perhaps, is the New England Anti-Slavery Society. So in trying to think about origins and overlap, but also about what overtakes what, and what directs our attention as historians and as scholars. So in thinking about those moments of both, I mean, there is the moment where they're, walking out arm in arm, black woman and white woman, through the Boston mob that wants to lynch Garrison. So there are the moments when you're not feigning the absolute life-sustaining need for solidarity, right? And I think that's critical to our understanding. Sometimes they need to be prodded, but then within a moment, they have an opportunity to realize that that is what will actually sustain the movement, protect it as a whole.
And I really appreciated the question, because one of the things that I keep being faced with is the possible sort of global implications of what is going on in terms of the age of revolution, right, in the 1830s. So we're talking about Europe and the foment, and yet I'm finding schools that are being founded on the western frontier, so sort of Ohio, Indiana, we're in the middle of nowhere, by African Americans and whites that have as their charter that the schools will be open to all, regardless of class, religion, gender, and race. That is in their charter. These are schools where African American is the first president, but the first director is white. I mean, these are truly multiracial, and it sounds so revolutionary. I keep hearing sort of distant echoes of what's going on in France and other places at this time. And I'm just beginning to explore those connections, but I really appreciate you sort of asking that question, because it does reflect what I'm definitely seeing as, out on the frontier.
Just a very, very quick note in response to that. These are wonderful comments. I think the age of revolution is critical here, particularly the notion of a sense of universal belonging, right? And African Americans, as the people who confront the most both formal and informal challenges to belonging, are the ones with the most to gain from a truly universal sense, and therefore the ones who seek to proselytize on that basis. And that's part of the energy behind the whole 19th century in the United States, I think.
All right, we have time for one last question before the break.
I was very intrigued by your mention of the Statistical Society in D.C. Boston had the first statistical society in the United States, and I believe, and it was after England and Germany. So I'm wondering since you all look at records and statistics and are important in that, what connections there were between, Boston and the other societies and the roles of African Americans at that early stage of statistics?
Well, one thing I know is that at the same time as there was an African American Statistical Society in Washington, there was also one in Philadelphia, an African American one in Philadelphia, which is actually better known and has records preserved. And there was a lot of communication between African Americans in Washington and Philadelphia. So it sort of, you could imagine that people were talking about, oh, we should do this. Now, I think the question of why is really interesting, and I think it gets to sort of the empiricism of people in the 19th century. Actually, I was at one point co-teaching a class with a English professor who I work with named Ivy Wilson, and it was on antebellum black political culture, and we were teaching a lot of primary sources and pamphlets, and one of the things that came up again and again, actually in antebellum black pamphlet literature, newspapers, was engagement with statistics, with actually caring a lot about things like the U.S. Census. There were a couple of, I think it was either the 1830 or 1840 census was very, very politicized and controversial because some people interpreted the numbers to suggest that African Americans in the North, the population was declining. And so people interpreted that to mean that a kind of brief against freedom, that in freedom African Americans would not thrive. So the black press mounted a defense of that, both saying that the numbers were inaccurate and also that it just wasn't at all the case. It didn't have the political, first of all, it wasn't true, but secondly, that the political ramifications were incorrect. And so, I mean, I actually think this would make a wonderful subject of study, because there is this very strong interest among black intellectuals and writers in engaging with these numbers and using statistics about wealth, population, schools, property, health, to make an argument for citizenship. And it goes back into the antebellum North, and it continues into the post-Civil War South, as people like Michelle Mitchell have shown.
Great.
Can I just add one thing to that? I just want to say just one quick thing. What that suggests is that perfectionism is scientific as well as spiritual, right?
Okay, we're going to take a break for 15 minutes. We'll start again at 11 o'clock. However, please join me in thanking our panelists for a fabulous start to our conference.